Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled The Factors That Drive High Performance Product Teams. My name is Rihanna Collier. I'm Vice President of the Software Division here at SIIA. For those of you unfamiliar with the SIIA, we are a global trade association representing over 800 software and content companies. And one of our goals is to provide industry data and information that can help you make strategic business decisions to help scale your company. So we are delighted to host this webinar today to help you drive higher performing products teams. Before I turn it over to today's presenter, there are just a few housekeeping reminders. First of all of your phone lines are set on mute. We do want to be sure to answer all of your questions, so please ask your questions at any time throughout the presentation via the chat box to the left of your screen. We'll be sure to address all questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with the slide deck, will be made available following today's presentation. An email will be sent to you with both links. And finally, I want to highlight a few upcoming SIIA events. First, our annual Coady Awards nominations are due this Friday, September 20th. If you're not familiar with the Coadys are the industry's only peer-recognized awards program. It's a great opportunity to gain exposure for your products and your company. I encourage you to submit your nominations by Friday because we do have an extended nomination period. However, that nomination period does have a fee increase after this Friday, so get those nominations in. The website is there for your reference, and of course feel free to reach out to SIIA with any questions. Also, we have an event coming up in December called Deciphering Finance, which is a one-day conference for finance executives to discuss growth strategies. The event is complimentary to qualifying finance executives, so I encourage you to pass this along to your CFOs, your VPs of finance, as they'll also have the opportunity to receive CPE credit for their attendance. Again, the website is there on your screen. Please let us know if you have any questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. Greg Geraci is President of Actuation Consulting, and Actuation recently conducted this study on high performance product teams, and Greg has graciously agreed to share some of the findings with us today. So Greg, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rihanna. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend time with your audience. My name is Greg Geraci. I'm the President of Actuation Consulting, and every year we conduct, for the last 2 years, a study of global product teams, and really the factors that drive performance are those factors that actually impede product teams' performance. This is the second year we've conducted the study, and I'd like to share with you a couple things that resulted from this year's study. First, I'd like to give you just a brief introduction of the people who are involved in the development of the study. Also like to talk through some of the demographics of the people who participate in the study. This year we had 1,469 different organizations all contribute data to the study. We generally have about 1,500 on average, so good turnout again this year. We'll also talk a little bit about role clarification questions, get into product development methodology insights. We've been tracking changes in product development usage and adoption for the last couple of years, and the data is pretty insightful. And we'll drill down a little bit into last year's findings and then also share some findings from this year's study that were, a couple of them were in line with last year's findings in the regression analysis, and a few of them are new ones that just popped up this year. So I'll walk you through those findings as well, at which point I'll turn it back over to Rihanna and we'll do some Q&A. So let me begin. First of all, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with me, my name is Greg Geraci. I am the study author. I'm the author of a global bestseller called Take Charge Product Management. It's currently #2 on Amazon, I'm pleased to say. I've also led the development of the Guide to the Product Management and Marketing Body of Knowledge, which was an effort of about 60 industry professionals, the majority of which were in the product management community, to put in place the first BOC for the product management profession. It just was released 2 weeks ago. It was a 3-year effort. So I'm very glad that it's actually seeing the light of day. And I'm also an adjunct professor at DePaul University's College of Computing and Digital Media, where I teach a course on product management. And in fact, I believe I am the only professor of product management to undergraduates in the entire United States. My co-authors, there are three of them. One of them is David Height. He's with me in spirit today, but obviously not here to present. So David is actually the president of the Chicagoland chapter of the IIBA, and he works very closely with our organization. He's been a co-author of the last 2 years of the study. Also with me in spirit is Ron Lichty. He is another co-author and a principal at Ron Lichty Consulting. He's also the co-author of a book called Managing the Unmanageable: Rules, Tools, and Insights for Managing Software, People, and Teams. Ron's been invaluable, and he's a new addition to this year's co-authors. Ron was not with us for the first year that we conducted the study, and he's added a tremendous amount of value. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. And also, the third co-author is a gentleman by the name of Stephen Stark. He's an expert in product management. He works closely with my company, Actuation Consulting, and he's the author of Stop the Project Management Survival Plan. So on to the study. This year, we were very privileged to actually have doubled the amount of sponsors and industry participants, promotional partners, of which SIIA was one of our proud partners. And I really appreciated both their support and the ability to share the findings with the members of their organization. What I'd like to point out is in the sponsors, you'll notice that AIPMM is there. They're the large product management and marketing association with a global reach. PDMA is another one of our proud sponsors. IIBA Chicagoland, Planbox, which is a project management software provider, and IPMA, the International Project Management Association, were all sponsors of this year's study. And the thing that makes this study so unique, if you really take a second to think about it, is there are really no other studies of this type where the various associations all come together in support of one study. And these findings are shared, of course, through a white paper that we published that's available for free, that's sponsored by the funded by the sponsors and the promotional partners. But what makes this study truly unique is the cross-functional nature, not only of the members of the team that actually write the white paper and do the presentations, but also by the organizations that sponsor it. It's usually the only time that these groups work together towards a common cause. You'll notice in the promotional partners group we have the Chicago Product Management Association. Lee Lambert is a well-known project management thought leader. His group, Lambert Consulting Group, is one of our promotional partners. The Orange County Product Managers, PMI, the Project Times, Product Management Talk, SVPMA, the Silicon Valley Product Management Association, and UXPA, which is the User Experience Professionals Association. And once again, I want to thank the Software and Information Industry Association, Rihanna and her team, especially Katie, for their support with this year's study. And this year we had twice the amount of association of partners that we did previously, so we continue to pick up a lot of steam across the various functional areas. So I'd like to talk for a minute and give you some background on the survey method that was used. What we do is the sponsors and promotional partners email invitations to take part in a web-based survey to organizations within their networks. And all respondents are anonymous unless they choose to optionally disclose. We do make available to the respondents the ability to be the first ones to receive the study in return for their willingness to participate. So it's an optional disclosure if they want to get a copy of the white paper, upon completion. And we were really interested in hearing from the following roles. I won't read them, but one of the things I would like to actually point out is that development managers and user experience professionals in last year's study were generally about 1 or 2% of the total. And this year, the numbers were significantly better, and I'll show you the data in those in a minute. And we attribute this largely to Ron Lichty's involvement in trying to get more organizations both on the engineering side, as well as my ability to develop a relationship with the UXPA's President Rich Gunther and Carol Smith, their Vice President, who supported this year's study as well. And as I mentioned earlier, 1,469 organizations participated in the study, and the study's results were put through regression analysis by a statistical analysis firm. So let's get into the demographics a little bit. The first question that we have listed here is, that we asked respondents was, do you play an active role creating or enhancing products or services within your organization? The intent of this question, is pretty straightforward. We want to make sure that the people that respond to the survey are people that are actively involved in the product development process, given that our survey looks at the dynamics of effective product teams. And the majority, approximately 94%, were actively involved in product development activities. Only 6% approximately were not, and these were primarily consultants and senior executives who responded to the study. We then asked, what's the primary role that you play on the product development team, as the second question. And as you'll note here, product managers had the largest response at about 28%. Followed by business analysts at almost 14%, other at about 13%, and other was composed primarily of folks who didn't think that the categories that we had listed necessarily met aligned with their way of thinking of their role. For example, Scrum Masters, typically responded in the other category. Consultants and executives also rolled up there as well. We had a nice representation from the project management community, and you'll notice a little bit below that program managers made up another 7%, so program and project made up almost 18, maybe 19% of the total. Engineers last year were 1%, so with Ron's support, we were able to pick up another 6.5% approximately. Product owners, 7%. And development managers, once again, a significant increase here as well, moving up from about 1% last year to about 7% this year. User experience was up significantly 3 times as well. And brand managers, sort of lagged. So we had a nice representative sample this year. Our numbers were even better in terms of representation across the various roles on a product team than we had in the previous year. We then asked, which of the following titles do you report directly into? And the number one response was manager at about 27%, but we had a very nice distribution. You'll notice that director comes in at about 24%, reporting into a C-level officer is about 21%, and a vice president at 19%, and other at 9%. So a very nice spread, good representative, almost bell curve, if you will, in terms of the types of titles that respondents reported into. The next question we asked around demographics was, which of the following best describes your organization's primary business focus? As you can tell by looking at the bar chart, we were weighted a little bit heavily this year towards tech companies, which make up about 43% of respondents. 26% of respondents were in services businesses, 17% in other, which tended to, these respondents tended to cite a vertical like energy or online collaboration, and not one of the categories that we had listed here. And then consumer products, which has been the smallest category year over year, came in at about 9%. And the demographics really do give you a good sense of who participated in this year's survey, and there are a lot more details in the white paper as well. So let's shift our focus to the second thread, role clarification. So we asked a question this year that we did not ask in last year's study. How do you define the role of a product manager in your organization? And as you can see by the pie chart, 41% of respondents basically said that their role of a product manager was well defined, but the product managers in their organization primarily relied on influence to get the job done. You'll notice that the second largest response was at 25% was the PM role is not well defined in our organization. That's obviously a significant amount of organizations that don't have a lot of clarity in the product manager role. 19% responded well-defined with full P&L responsibility. So, only about 19% of organizations globally, since this is a global study, responded that their product managers actually have a P&L. 14% said we do not have a product manager, and 2% responded other. And these tended to be responses like our CEO is the product manager. So early stage companies that hadn't yet evolved, developed a product management function. We then asked about who on the team really has the most influence with the executive team or key stakeholder. And what we learned is that if you take a look at this closely, you'll see that product manager comes out high at about 31%. Obviously, there were a lot of product managers that responded to the study, so I think to some extent that probably has something to do with the number. But when you couple product owner as well as product manager together, it paints a pretty clear picture at about 54, maybe 53%, that either the product manager or the product owner are really the ones that have the most influence with the executive team in most organizations based on the responses. The third category after product owner was other, and people who responded there tended to list something like a title such as VP as opposed to a role, and they made up about 10% of responses. Program managers came in really third place, I guess, at 9.45%. Project managers following closely behind. Engineers falling off a little bit at 8%, and then business analysts, brand managers, and user experience bringing up the back of the pack. So it was pretty clear that, at least from the context of the members of the team, that product managers and product owners really are overwhelmingly the ones with the most influence with the executive team based on the survey responses. So let's take a little closer look at the product development methods that are currently in use. And we asked survey respondents what methods the product teams were using to develop their products. We got some interesting data. So what we found is that the dominant methodology currently in use at 43, almost 44% is blended, which we define as some combination of waterfall and some variation of agile. I think as everybody on the call knows, agile is really more of an umbrella term, and there are a series of different methodologies that sit neatly underneath it. XP, for example, or Scrum. So we didn't actually ask them which methodology, but what we did ask was, what methodology are you using? And blended came out on top. What's interesting to note, though, is that there was a decrease of almost 9% from last year in the blended category. Last year we had about 52.5%. This year it's at 43%, so there's a significant fall off of organizations that moved from blended into other methodologies. And the biggest beneficiary was actually Agile. Last year's numbers showed that Agile organizations represented about 13% pure Agile. This year it was up to 30%. So you can see that the majority of organizations that had been utilizing blended methodologies had moved a large portion of them to a pure Agile approach. So they were, I guess another way to say it is that they were using blended methodologies as they stepped away perhaps from waterfall type methodologies into a more pure Agile environment. Waterfall also decreased significantly from last year. Last year, waterfall represented 18% of responses, and this year it's at almost 13%. I always get a chuckle out of those who report that they don't know which methodology their organization is using this year. It was close to the same as last year. It was about 7%. And other folks tended to use terms like stage gate or we just code it as responses in this area, made up about 5%. And lean, which had decreased significantly also this year from last year. Last year it was at 6%, and this year it's just about 3%. So there were some significant changes in the rate of response. We're going to continue to track the evolution of these methodologies in terms of their adoption and sort of what happens on a year-over-year basis going forward. But the indications this year are that blended still the strongest, but losing a little bit of steam. Agile's picking up more, momentum. Waterfall's continuing to decay, and lean has also fallen off pace just a little bit. So let me show you a more detailed breakdown of this data as well as we sort of overlay size of company in terms of revenue by method in use. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of the various methods that we just discussed a second ago. And across the top, you'll notice that we've divided these into categories: less than $50 million, $50 million to 500, 500 to 2 billion, and above 2 billion. And let's focus in on the waterfall column for a second. What you'll notice is, and this is entirely consistent with what one would expect to see, that organizations that are smaller in size are the ones that use waterfall the least. So those under 500 million. But as an organization scales, or has scaled, you can see that those numbers increase to, the range of moving from, let's say, 18% to 28% for those of 500 million to 2 billion, and above 2 billion, you can see that it's at 37%. So it's exactly what you would expect to see. And if you look at Agile, about 4 rows down, you'll see the exact inverse, where smaller organizations, less than 50 million, about 50%, 55% of organizations are using, pure Agile. As the organization grows in size, those numbers continue to decline almost by half. So, as you go from 54% at the 50 million, it drops to 23%, for the 50 million to 500 million, then down to 14% from 500 million to 2 billion, and then over 2 billion, you're in single digits at about 9%. So you can see that the inverse applies, both with waterfall and with Agile. They're strong where you would expect them to be, and weaker where you would expect them to be as well. On the blended front, the numbers are very similar to last year, where they're pretty consistent across, a little bit more blended in the less than 50 million, but at which point you pretty much get almost like a straight line, with 50 million to 2 billion being in the 20s, I guess, on average. And then if you look at lean, it's very consistent with last year as well, fairly consistent across the board, a little bit more with companies of 2 billion, and we attribute this to the fact that organizations of over $2 billion tend to utilize lean to take costs out of some of their processes or their products. And so, there are really more cost reduction efforts taking place as opposed to, say, lean startup methodologies, which you would expect to see more in the less than $50 million range. So anyways, that's what we attribute the bigger increase in the larger companies is really cost reduction initiatives. And there's a fair amount of organizations, particularly in startup organizations, that don't know. And you can see that it falls off as an organization gets bigger in scale. So, we get asked the question a lot, why is waterfall still hanging on so much with large organizations? And the answer to that is, there's a lot of reasons why large companies actually need to hang on to waterfall-type methodologies. For example, heavy regulation. If you're in the pharma or medical device area, you may have to go through FDA approvals, which require having really consistent and well-defined processes that that are repeatable and demonstratable. So organizations that are in those areas, or even financial services, may opt to choose to use waterfall approaches because they help to augment their ability to meet regulatory requirements. And organizations that have a high degree of complexity, also are those that typically tend to have complex products, tend to have more of a waterfall type kind of approach. But overall, there were some significant changes year over year in terms of waterfall and Agile, and in terms of how people were moving out of blended into Agile methodologies, and then also that waterfall was continuing to lose a little bit of pace, if you will. We asked a new question this year that we did not ask last year. And in fact, this was based on a question that one of our audience asked last year about profitability. So we wanted to start to get our arms around if there's a correlation between the method being used by an organization and the perception of increased profitability resulting from the use of a particular methodology. And here's what we found. When we asked the question, which methodology do you associate with increasing the profitability of your product, we found that Agile really wins the perception contest at about 39 or 40%. Blended follows a close second at about 34%. Lean came in third at about 13%. Other and waterfall, make up the remaining totals. Interestingly, even though the takeaway from this is even though organizations basically are forced to utilize waterfall, for example, in those environments where regulatory requirements, predicate that they utilize some type of approach like that, they're well aware of the fact that it doesn't lead necessarily to the most profitable product. As you can see, only 6% of respondents basically believe waterfall is the methodology of choice to make your products more profitable. In fact, agile and blended methodologies far and away dominate. So there are reasons why organizations continue to use waterfall, but even in those instances, the participants in those processes do not largely believe that waterfall really does lead to more profitable products. So before we dive into this year's factors, I thought it might be helpful for those of you who didn't have a chance to hear the findings from last year to briefly recap those so that we can talk a little bit about which ones reappeared this year and then also get into some of the new ones that came out of the regression analysis this year. So for last year's study, which was entitled The 5 Factors of High Performance Product Teams, there were 5 key factors that came out really loud and clear in the regression analysis in terms of what defined high-performance product teams. And statistically, the statistical firm, we weren't even looking for this, but when they did the regression analysis, these 5 factors basically indicated that the likelihood of a product team performing at a high level was 67% if all 5 of these factors were effectively deployed. And only 2% in their absence, which really took us off our feet. We were not expecting this. We weren't even looking for that. So the factors that came up in the regression analysis, just to briefly recap, were unwavering executive team support, and team is the operative word, meaning that what we found in the regression analysis last year is that product teams that actually had exposure to the executive team as opposed to a single executive stakeholder were more likely to be high performing. The second factor in last year's study was strong product team alignment with the company's business strategy. And what we found was that teams that did not have strong alignment struggled for a variety of different reasons. And those that actually did, typically ended up in the high-performing team category. Post-product development focus. So this really speaks to product launch. And last year's findings indicated that organizations that had a singular point of contact to manage product launch, so one person accountable for it, were more likely to be high-performing than those that did not. And in fact, it's pretty ironic because as we presented these survey findings last year, when you did a show of hands in each of the sessions, by far, only maybe 10% of organizations actually had one person dedicated to actually ensuring the successful launch and taking full accountability for it. And in fact, 90% of respondents indicated that their organizations did not do that. So even informal hand-raising sessions continued to validate that organizations underestimate the importance of this particular factor. Assigning core team members, last year we found that about 42% of organizations feel like they assign the right people to the right tasks to drive product team performance. But there were a lot of things that could be done on the product team to improve their performance. One of them was a factor in and of its own, which was onboarding. And what we found last year was that organizations that had a strong process to onboard new employees onto the product team, not into the organization, were more likely to be high performing than those that did not have those processes. So now that we've set the context based on last year's findings, I'd like to share with you this year's findings from the regression analysis. So the first one has to do with, it was a carryover from last year. It came up again in the regression analysis. High performance product teams need to link to a well-communicated corporate strategy. So this was a similar theme from last year. There were a couple of those. We found this year that only 37% of organizations indicated that they had a coherent business strategy that the product team could link to. And I suspect there's many people on the phone that would probably agree with this. In fact, 54% of respondents indicated that the corporate product strategy was poorly communicated or was shifting so rapidly that product teams were unable to actually link to it. And I just presented this information at the Chicago Product Management Association last week, and in fact the majority of people in the room represented the view of the 54%, where they felt like their organizations, for a variety of reasons, did not have a clearly communicated corporate business strategy that the product teams could link to. So it bears out in our live sessions as well. And without clarity on the overarching business strategy, product teams tend to focus purely on tactical activities without the needed context. In fact, that is one of the major factors, that drives high-performing teams. Their ability to be able to understand the context for the decisions they make and how they can actually link to and support the overall strategy with both their strategic plan at the product line level or product team level and make better decisions, not only on a project basis, but over the longer term. So this particular one comes up year over year for the last 2 years. The second factor, this one's a bit different. We talked last year, we discovered that, product teams linking to executive teams were really important as opposed to individual stakeholders. But what we found this year is that business unit leader engagement is also very important. High-performance product teams tended, at least as it was demonstrated in the regression analysis, to work more closely with the senior business unit leader, either the CEO or a GM. In fact, the greater access to necessary information and resources led to better alignment with the company goals. So while it's important for the product teams to work closely with a wide sway of executives, the connection to the most senior executive is very important as well. In fact, 23% of business unit leaders who stated that they maintain line of sight on both the strategic and tactical activities state that they benefit from increased product team performance. So there's no question that there's a direct correlation between executive access, both to extended members of the team as opposed to an individual stakeholder, as well as directly to the most senior executive, and ensuring that there's two-way communication that's established and line of sight. And now that's obviously harder to do in organizations of larger scale and easier to do in smaller and mid-sized organizations, but it's something that obviously needs to be, designed into the organization if you want to enhance the performance levels of product teams. The third factor was the importance of defining the product manager role. What we found in the regression analysis that teams that were high performing tended to have a clearly defined product manager role, which ultimately led to higher levels of performance. We found a direct correlation between high performance and how well the product manager role is defined. In fact, 60% of respondents believe it's well defined in their organization. And that's either well defined with the use of influence, as is typical in a let's call it a technology company where a product manager doesn't have P&L responsibility, or in those instances where a product manager does, for example, maybe a consumer products company, that 18 or 19% coupled with that 41% of respondents who believe that it was well defined, but that through influence made up 60% of the total. And high-performing teams rely upon product managers to align their efforts, they tell us, with corporate strategy to synthesize the needs into valuable products and product plans and to drive prioritization. In fact, product managers and product owners, if you think about it, are the only parties that stay with the product across the entire product lifecycle in most organizations. And in fact, that was a question that we asked in the 2012 study. And the only other person, role-wise, that actually tended to stay with the product was actually the lead engineer, and that was in single digits at about 9%. So product managers and product owners are the only ones that generally stick with the product throughout all the 7 phases of the product management lifecycle. And the regression analysis clearly indicates that the more clearly the role is defined, the higher the probability that the team will perform at a high level. So that was a new finding from this year's study that we did not see in last year's results. Interestingly, onboarding came up again this year, and it just makes us all the more resolved to really understand the dynamics of the onboarding process of the best practices. In fact, only 4% of organizations indicate that they have a best practice onboarding product team members. And it came through, once again in the regression analysis twice now, how important this is. If you think about it, most organizations spend a lot of time, energy, and resources onboarding individuals into the organization, but we don't spend typically the same amount of energy onboarding new team members onto product teams. And effectively onboarding new product team members is highly correlated to high performance on the product team. As I said earlier, only 4% of organizations report a best practice in onboarding new team members, and they tend to view these processes as proprietary and confidential differentiators. In fact, we reached out to those who said that they'd be willing to talk to us, who fell into the best practice group, and we were only able to talk to a couple of them. The rest of them cited proprietary methods and processes that they didn't want to divulge as part of our study. So it's clear that organizations that do have a good process see this as something that leads to a competitive advantage from their perspective. 75% of responding organizations acknowledge that they do not place sufficient emphasis on this process, and they tend to rely on sink or swim organizational mindsets, which leads to lots of lost time and ultimately lost productivity. The final factor, from this year's study was the importance of product launch. And again, this was one that we touched on last year, but we dove a bit deeper into this year. What we found is that proper staffing and funding enables teams to achieve higher levels of performance, that is, of product launch. And ironically, millions of dollars are being spent shepherding products throughout the development cycle, only to fumble the ball at launch. And this gets back to last year's finding where, for a variety of reasons, there isn't a single individual stakeholder that, then takes responsibility for driving this. So that's one of the common failure points. Not properly staffing it, not properly funding it, not having a good, product launch strategy in place that aligns with the goals of the business as well as resources. And just think how disheartening this is to teams, and how wasteful from an organizational perspective this is to get all the way to the goal line and then fumble the ball at launch. Last year's study showed the importance of having a single person accountable for launch as a key factor. This year's study shows that only 37% of organizations believe they do it well. High-performance teams not only have one person responsible for launch, but this data showed us they also appropriately plan, staff, and resource the activity for success. So with that, let's go to the next factor, which is, in fact, the inverse, if you will, which is what are the landmines that trip up product teams, from the perspective of members of product teams. And this is sort of an inverse, if you will. It's not what makes them successful, it's what trips them up. So where does the effectiveness of your product team break down? Survey respondents tell us that not having enough resources to get the job done properly came in as number one at about 34%. I expect this to always be the number one regardless of what year we ask this, but we did see a decline from last year to this year, and I attribute that in part to the fact that the economy is starting to get back on track, so organizations are adding more resources, and as they do that, this number is falling, but we're talking about a difference of about 5%. The second highest factor that trips up teams is the handoffs between the functions. So, particularly respondent-cited requirements, moving from product management to, the engineering team is one of the common places where this happens frequently. Lack of executive leadership and direction, and this ties back to our conversation early about high-performing teams being able to link back up to the company's corporate strategy and having line of sight and clarity on those goals and objectives. And this was about 18%. Poorly defined roles. Once again, we talked about this a little bit, about 25% of organizations really not having very good clarity on the product manager role continues to show up in the data on product teams overall, with about 17% of respondents citing that as a major factor, and then other making up approximately 10%. So with that, this year's study sheds additional light on the factors that drive high performance. And in fact, any of the factors, either from last year's study, those key 5 factors, or the new ones that we added in this year around, business leader access, clearly defining the product manager role, and, keeping in mind the landmines that undermine success. If you look at not only last year's factors plus the ones that came out in this year's regression analysis as new, if you focus on any of those factors within your organization, it will statistically have an impact, significantly have an impact on the performance of your product team. And that came through loud and clear in the regression analysis. For those of you who would like to get a copy of the white paper, it's available for free. You can get it at our website, www.actuationconsulting.com. You'll find that it is very comprehensive. It's about 30 pages in length, and it covers a lot more detail than we've been able to cover on today's webinar. I would encourage you to get a copy at no charge to you, and if you don't want to be part of our database, we do ask for your email information and name, but you can easily unsubscribe if you don't want to be a part of participating in future studies or receiving any type of emails from us. And I would encourage you to get a free copy. And with that, let me turn it back over to Rihanna. Rihanna, if folks do want to reach out to me, my information is listed here. And also Ron Lichty, who is the co-author of this year's study, in case anybody would like to speak to him. Our information is listed above. So Rihanna, I turn it back to you.
Thanks, Greg. I thought that was great. I certainly learned a lot. I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Greg, feel free to submit those via the chat box on the left of your screen. I also want to let the audience know that we will include a link to the white paper in the follow-up from this presentation with the recording from the webinar. Greg, I had a question from you, just from your perspective, in doing this now for 2 years. What was the most compelling finding from your perspective this year?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Rihanna. I think the finding around profitability I find very interesting. The thing that's sort of funny is that organizations, even organizations that use waterfall don't believe it, leads to profitability. And to me, that was not something that I would have, it makes sense that you would find that in the study's findings when you look at profitability, because I think intuitively, most people don't believe that waterfall's the most profitable way to develop products. But it was shocking to actually hear organizations acknowledge that they were aware of the fact that it wasn't the most profitable and still continued to utilize it. And, I think for the reasons that I said earlier, a lot of them probably are in highly, evolved regulatory environments where they're forced to use it. But just to hear that admission that even members of the product team who are utilizing these methodologies really don't have faith in it in terms of leading to more, higher profitability was actually sort of stunning to me. I think it's a fact, but it was sort of shocking when I first read it.
Mm-hmm. Now, after looking at this year's study, are there certain data points that you feel you will kind of expand on next year, or even maybe other data points that you're going to add to the study?
Yeah, we do listen to the questions from our audiences, Rihanna, so the profitability question was added as a result of that, as I mentioned earlier. So as we go around and do the presentation, this year, we probably have to do it about 30 times, we listen a lot to the types of questions that we get. One of the things that we're thinking of diving into as sort of an ancillary area and conducting a more detailed study on, two areas in particular. One has to do with sort of the onboarding side of this. We think that there's a lot more information that could be uncovered in terms of successful onboarding practices. And the second side of it has to do with product launch. That's another area where we feel like with so many dollars being invested in product development, but the failure rate being so high on product launch, that we could get maybe do a study just on product launch in and of itself. So those are two areas that I think we want to peel back the onion even more and try to get more clarity on.
And when will you be conducting next year's study? And then also, kind of a question tied to that, how do people get involved from a sponsorship/partner perspective or also as a participant in the study?
Sure. So if folks are interested in being either a distribution, a promotional partner or a sponsor, they can reach out to me directly. I'm the one that tends to manage that as part of our, four-man team. So I welcome anybody's interest and would like the opportunity to talk to you about it. That's something that you'd like to, participate with us in. As it relates to when we conduct the study, we generally conduct the study in January. So we do most of the development of the study questions and, line up our statistical analysis firm, which we've used the same one now year over year. Probably do so next year too, in the December time frame. And then in January, usually around January 15th, we actually launch the survey through our partners. And at which point it takes a couple months for us to get through the regression analysis process and then work with my counterparts to draft the white paper and then publish it. So we usually publish the white paper in the March or April time frame. And that's sort of the schedule that seems to work best. We catch some folks in the spring and early summer. There tends to be a little bit of a quiet lull during the July-August time period. And then when September rolls around, we find that we do a lot of presenting on the study via our sponsors and promotional partners, and that generally carries us into the first quarter of the next year.
Great, Greg. Well, this has been fantastic. I encourage everybody on the line to get in touch with Greg, not only if you have any questions or if you want to participate for next year, but maybe you've got data points that you'd like to see included in next year's study. Certainly, I'm sure he would welcome that feedback. So thanks again, Greg, for your time. Again, everyone, you'll be receiving an email with a link to the full white paper from the study, along with a link to the recording of this presentation. I encourage you to share it with your colleagues, as I think there's some really interesting data that comes out of it and that can help everybody apply to their own business and their own product teams. So with that, Greg, thank you again, and I wish everybody a great day.